Game loaded.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of Lessons Learned with your host, Rafael Piñero. Welcome to the first Mathsquad Podcast with Sam M. and Scaridium. Hi, guys.
Hello. Hello.
This time around, we're going to be talking about tabletop RPGs. I know it's not video games, but they're related, and I also like to play them, so we're going to talk about them. A reminder that the Math Squad is a community that serves and helps and formed around one and only Adam Coble. Not Alex. I'm sure he doesn't mind the name. That's Skinny Ghost on Twitter and on Twitch. If you like his stuff, you can check him on Twitch, YouTube, and or Twitter. And he's been very grateful to allow us to do this podcast with the community. And hopefully more members will join up later. And we get to talk about, well, the stuff we love, like tabletop RPGs. So for the first program, we're going to be talking about, very simply, the RPGs that we like and why we like them. So, anybody has a preferred RPG they want to talk about?
Well, personally, I'm honestly, I like to play basically everything. I love just playing like as many different types of games as I can get my hands on. But lately, my favorites have been, to GM is Dungeon World, just hands down my favorite to GM. But I've been having an absolute blast playing Burning Wheel. The last couple weeks, I just started playing with a group, and I'm having an absolute blast with that game. I think it is so good.
And what is it? Yeah, sorry about that. What is it about Burning Wheel and Dungeon World that you really like, that you enjoy so much?
So, for Dungeon World in particular, I am an incredibly lazy GM. I like my skill set as a GM lies very heavily on the improv side as opposed to the preparation side, and that is facilitated excellently in Dungeon World as opposed to, for example, a game like Burning Wheel. I wouldn't really want to run just because it takes a little bit more upkeep. And I'm the type of GM who likes to, I don't do a lot of prep. I'm not a very prep-heavy GM. As far as Burning Wheel goes, what I really love about that system is the way that the game is so character-focused, and that's what I love about RPGs, is telling character stories and telling stories in general. And the game facilitates really well sort of this idea of like, be whatever kind of character you want, and then it rewards you for acting like that character even when it's not necessarily a good thing to do so, if that makes sense. It does a great job of rewarding suboptimal play, which I think makes the game much more interesting.
So we're talking about RPGs that are character-driven and player-driven. Because Dungeon World puts a lot on the players to sort of come up with their own ideas. But if they don't do that, then it can be a bit of a problem. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I really enjoy that Dungeon World sort of skews the line between player and GM a little bit, and that the creative process includes the players a little bit more. I actually haven't really had much trouble personally with like getting people to participate in games of Dungeon World. But I find that if you sort of, I don't know, putting the players on the spot is the right word, but so for example, in Dungeon World, when someone makes a roll and I as the GM, I say a little something and then I look to the player and I say, what is this and this about? Or how do you know this? Or, why do you want this information? Basically, if I'm asking them like a very direct question about the world or about their character, and there's no I don't know, because if you say I don't know, it's if they tell me I don't know, what is it? I look at them and say, I don't know, what is it? And so when you sort of put the players in that situation, most people will give you what you're looking for, because they're the type of people who want to sit down and play a role-playing game are the type of people who want to participate in that way. They just need a little bit of prompting sometimes.
So, Scaridium, I always mess up the handle. What are your games that you prefer?
So I've sort of arrived at a similar point where a couple of years back, I would have been a hardcore proponent of like the 3.5 / Pathfinder ethos, but the more I've DM'd games and actually run them, the further and further and further towards Burning Wheel I've gotten in sort of how my philosophy of good role-playing gets done. And so I sort of arrived at the same point where, like, Adam frequently professes that he is now, where it's just, well, yeah, I mean, other RPGs exist, but I could just play Burning Wheel. And a lot of it does come down to the same things, and I definitely notice that same sort of dichotomy in that a lot of everything about Burning Wheel is just so intensely character-driven, but its setting is so pre-established that it can be hard to sort of reconcile what you want out of your characters and also what you want out of the world. And I think, yeah, definitely the Apocalypse World systems are better about sort of establishing a pattern among players of, well, here's craft, sort of like a pattern of teaching them to craft more things about their characters, more things about the world. And it's a philosophy that works very, very well in Burning Wheel, but it's not something you learn from Burning Wheel. It's something you have to learn in other games and then take it to Burning Wheel to make it work.
I think that's a really... I'm sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead.
I think that's a really, really good point. My two biggest complaints about Burning Wheel are, A, I think the book is just horribly laid out.
Yes.
And B is, I hate it when they do exactly what you're talking about. It's like there's very like inherent setting stuff that's just never explained. So like a lot of times, and this happens especially with like the orc, elf, and dwarf life paths and that sort of stuff, is like they'll just throw out a term or a word as though like everyone just like inherently knows what that is. And I don't know if the intent is just that like you're supposed to define it yourself in play, but to me it just sort of reads as like confusing, and it's like, all right, so there is an inherent setting, you're just not going to tell me what it is.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, where it uses words not necessarily as like descriptors, but more as like a noun as some effect or intrinsic thing. So it's a thing Apocalypse World does all the time, where it's like, go hard. And it's not actually talking about it necessarily just as the phrase go hard, but it is itself a actual move and term that has other weighted meanings. And so Burning Wheel does a little bit of that, but also it's heavily drawing from a lot of like classic fantasy lit. And so
yeah,
if you're not intimately familiar with a lot of that literature, where all of this stuff originated from can seem really obscure.
Definitely.
And so that's definitely part of why I'm not a huge fan of the more fantasy elements of Burning Wheel.
Well, that actually kind of cracks me up about Burning Wheel, is that it claims to be this system that is like Lord of the Rings or Wizards of Earthsea, you know, this kind of epic old school fantasy. But the stories it tells are character stories, which is not at all epic old school fantasy. Like the Lord of the Rings is not about the characters at all. Nothing Tolkien wrote ever was. So I think that that's like a very interesting thing about the game. And I kind of agree with you, is that in the games that I've played, the best Burning Wheel games have been the ones where we sort of eschewed the more fantasy elements, and we, you know, it was still a fantastical world, but we're more playing just, you know, normal people of various, you know, class and rank, as opposed to like, you know, playing a mage and going to slay dragons or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, even among their like recorded sessions of their own like actual played through games, they very quickly and very heavily sort of lost that traditional fantasy sort of element to it. And while there still is quite a lot of fantasy within it, they don't really stick to any of this original setting material that was sort of in the book. And I think that was probably something that sort of evolved out of the system over time. But it's so much additional work then to just rewrite the system with that in mind when it already works as it is.
So
Definitely.
basically what we're talking about here is all the systems are more plot driven, where the game master or dungeon master has to basically lay down the plot and lay down the setting, or the company that publishes the game gives you a lot of meta, a lot of story to go with it, the setting, the world, the characters, that sort of thing. Versus these games sort of encourage the game to be created on the fly, right? Created by the characters, very character-driven stories. Is that the gist I'm getting out of it?
Yeah, it's sort of a direction of creative intent, where with a lot of older games, it's you take all of this outside material and then you channel it inwards into whatever your characters and story are, and you use all of that setting to inform. While with a lot of the newer systems, it's you've come up with like a concept of who your character is and what you want out of your character and the story. And then you sort of craft an environment around them that is conductive to that.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. It sort of feels to me like sort of these older games, or this older style of game, it's like they, like you were saying, it's like you take all of this sort of, fantasy or sci-fi exposure media that you've absorbed and then like put it into the setting. Whereas I feel like games like Dungeon World or mostly any Powered by the Apocalypse, it's like, okay, you've absorbed all of this like fantasy knowledge. Now you just make it up.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very interesting because right now, I would say that my favorite game is games based on the Dragon Age system done by Green Ronin. And definitely, of course, it has a lot of stuff that's brought from the Dragon Age games, right? So it's already a pre-existing setting and characters and situations. I like the mechanics of it. I like the fact that the way they did the mechanics is that you can have the dragon dice. So it's more than just, two characters bashing at each other. They have these maneuvers happen when you get criticals. And so there's that element of that gives fights variance. And it's old school thinking. It's thinking about the mechanics first, focusing on the mechanics, the roll aspect of rolling the die, which I really like. But right now I'm playing 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. We call it the Sanctuary campaign. And pretty much it's just an open map, right? There's the city, but the city's not well defined. We have the characters, we have locations. And then as we're playing, each character sort of says, okay, this is my background. I came from this, or I know this person. And then we roll with it. So we're kind of playing 5th edition D&D, but using a mentality closer to the Apocalypse World situation without the countdown watch or something like that, with some modification. Like I decided that my dwarven cleric, I wasn't going to build a background for the character. Instead, I just make the background as I go along. And I do that. And it's like, oh yeah, I met this person here and I came from this place. And so far it seems to be working because the GM is working with me. Also, all this stuff requires a lot of trust between the GM and the characters. The characters are not going to exploit the situation to get the best advantage. And the GM will allow the story to evolve naturally as they bring it together.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with that. I think what helps with that is that these older games, I feel like a lot of times are sort of built in a more adversarial style where it's like the GM versus the players, whether they intend to or not. So that sort of, I think, encourages like the players are going to try to exploit everything they get, and the GM is going to try to, screw with the players whenever they do something that the GM can screw with them for. Whereas when you're playing a game like Dungeon World, it's more like we're all just telling this story together. So it feels less like, oh, the DM is screwing my character, and more like, oh, this is just the part of the story where something bad happens to my character. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But exactly. Now let's go down to the nitty-gritty, because, of course, we're talking about games, we're talking about systems. And I'm a pretty big systems guy. What are some of the systems that you like that encourage that kind of play?
Adversarial type of play, or
no, the more cooperative type of play?
Anything Powered by the Apocalypse, anything GM-less. You can make any game do it. It's sort of just the way. It's to me. I think it's maybe more about the players than the games necessarily. But what I think a big part of it is, at the end of the day, if you don't have mechanics to min-max, you can't min-max, you know?
No,
It's like
true.
in Dungeon World, you can't really min-max. There's nothing to min-max there, right? And in Burning Wheel, I mean, you can min-max, but it's just going to go terribly for you.
With Dungeon World, I disagree to a bit of an extent. But yeah, with Burning Wheel, it's a lot different what min-maxing entails because of just how their characters are made and what everything comes from.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think you're right. I mean, I think you can... It's a different type of min-maxing. It exists. It's just not the way you think of it in a game like, you know, AD&D. I mean, I think there's a place for min-maxing. Like, I play in a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons game and in a Stars Without Number game, and, like, seeing the big numbers go up is fun. Like, it can be fun if everyone's on board to, you know, do a number crunching type of game. It can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think a lot of where this sort of approach comes down to is sort of like where character actions come from. Like, the systems all detail what actions your character is capable of taking, and the motivation and purpose of those actions sort of defines what the game is trying to do. So, like, if with all these Pathfinder or D&D settings, all of the moves are kind of based around how do I exploit my immediate, like, physical environment or situation to gain advantage in a more, like, immediate, concrete, physical sense. Well, if you compare to things like Burning Wheel or Apocalypse World, it's much more about what would be, like, the social situation or ramifications of the scene that would get me a different advantage. So it's a lot less focused on what are the physical aspects of this area, and it's a lot more focused on what does my character want to get out of this scene. And so coming at it from those different directions sort of informs a lot of how the game ends up in play.
Also, I think that with the older games, there's a lot of focus on combat. I mean, you know, talk about the difficult game, the game between the player and the dungeon master, game master. That's a Gygaxian type of play. You go into a dungeon, you kick the door, there are monsters there. All that you have most of the time is designed to kill those monsters so you can take the treasure, then go and do it again and again. You know, it's the old trope of stealth, combat, and diplomacy, where combat is even stealth is a little bit of combat, because being stealthy is all about getting into position to knock out someone with a single blow, as opposed to just, you know, wailing at them, you know, for 5 or 10 rounds, you know, that as the numbers tick down or up, and then you kill them, take the treasure, and move on. Where it seems that these other games are more about the social long-range aspect of the character growth, and also the growth in the setting. Was that an accurate description?
Definitely. As opposed to the game being about we kill monsters, we take their stuff. It's about, why are you going to kill monsters to take their stuff? Like, why do you want the stuff? Why are you putting yourself in danger to get the stuff? What do you believe about the stuff? It focuses the game very differently. I think a interesting game from sort of that standpoint, because of sort of how it stands a bit in the middle, is a game like Stars Without Number. Other Kevin Crawford games do this a little bit too, where, like, mechanically they look a lot closer to like a Dungeons and Dragons game, but at the same time, I don't know what it is about the design. It could just be the way that we play the game with my group, but it feels much more spontaneous than a lot of, like, D&D type games where the GM just has, like, a story plan for you, just simply because, like, the sectors are so big that the GM can't really know more than just, like, a couple notes about each thing. And, like, so there's some general setting stuff, but it's like, this is your sector.
I think a lot of that comes down to, like, where advancement happens for players, where with, like, a lot of D&D and Pathfinder systems, a huge amount of player power and progression is tied up in what items do you physically possess. So a lot of it is tied up into, like, your direct material wealth and directly, like, what items do I have that give me new abilities? While with a lot of other systems and, like, Stars Without Number, your material possessions have some bearing, but the core of your character's power largely deals with where have you established yourself fictionally, or like how have you developed yourself as a person instead.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point, I think, especially because in Stars Without Number, it's sort of like you position yourself fictionally and the stuff follows a little bit more. It's like you don't get the TL5 gear until you shake the right hands. You know what I mean? Is like you can't just go buy that stuff. You have to position yourself fictionally, as opposed to like, you know, in D&D, you can't buy the sword, but, you know, you're not going to get the sword by making nice to the king either. You got to go find the sword in the dungeon.
So
and I think also like the really limited list of items in Stars Without Number sort of also plays into that, where it's like, even if you do get some of these powerful items, they don't actually grant you so much power that you sort of tier out of certain kinds of content. And there's also not enough material rewards that getting those material items can really be your main goal, because any individual item is not so unattainable that you actually have to progress there gradually over a long period of time either. There's just not enough there with material items to really
outside of the ships and the mechs, maybe. Yeah, I mean, I think that's also actually a huge problem with, like, 5th edition is, like, there's nothing to spend the gold on. Like, you get all this gold for going on adventures, and then you're like, all right, like, what can I, like, buy? And GM's like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's definitely something I noticed playing it, where it sort of presupposes that there's a healthy magical item economy in your world, just because there needs to be something players can spend their gold on. So if you don't want it to have like a very healthy magical item economy, then the alternative is you have to homebrew systems that can suck out a lot of gold, which is where all these things like town improvements and upgrades to different things like that end up coming in.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even by the book, like that stuff is like terrible. I mean, like, so, you know, by the book, it's like you've got like the things you can buy like a boat, but that's like 40,000 gold. And like you can buy like a castle for like 30,000 gold, but it's like there's nothing between like 40 gold and like tens of thousands of gold.
Yeah,
you would have
the GM guide works well for that. Yeah, it's just the GM guide I think bridges that gap somewhat better through all the material in there, but even then it's very vague about how it's all supposed to be used, and it doesn't quite do a good job of filling it out.
Yeah, another way I like to see this is that, and this is something an idea that I've been floating in my head for a long time. I even talked about, I tweeted it to Adam back in the day, is the idea of vertical advancement versus horizontal advancement. In other words, vertical is very simple, leveling up. Like you get more levels, more hit points, more abilities, better magical items, that sort of thing. The numbers tick up. The horizontal part is sort of controlling or impacting the setting, the map, if you will. I think one of the things about the Star Without Number is it's very much a sandbox, and it's about the region, it's about the politics, or the interactions. And so some systems have a more idea of like, what is the impact your character has on the world, on the setting, versus, I am just one of 1,000 characters who has reached level 12 and has +3 sword and has a +4 armor, and now I can go and kill adult dragons versus hatchlings and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, I think another example of like horizontal advancement would be stuff like Fate in Burning Wheel, or like I guess just Artha in general, or like Karma in Shadowrun, where it's like instead of making your numbers bigger, you can use those points to influence the setting and the fiction, and to change outcomes.
Yeah, I think another thing like Burning Wheel and Stars Without Number do, though, is that it's very, very hard to vertically advance, but it's not that hard to horizontally advance. So you end up getting characters with like very broad skill sets as they develop over time. And if you want to actually have like a very narrow skill set where you excel at like a very narrow amount of things, then you sacrifice a lot of ability in your character by not going broad, by not having a skill set big enough to cover a wide range of things. And the settings themselves actually sort of incentivize having a broad sort of skill set and abilities and power.
As opposed to, say, Shadowrun, which ironically gives you, it seems to give you all the possibilities in the world. You can create a freeform character, but if you don't specialize, you're out of luck because you basically won't be able to fit into the scheme of the party. Kind of like what happened in recently Mirror Shades, right? The characters that tended to do best were the ones who were hyper specialized. Characters that try to be more a little bit of everything were kind of out of the loop.
Yeah, I mean, the characters that were built correctly for Shadowrun succeeded at being Shadowrunners, and the characters that were built terribly were terrible. I mean, I think there are a lot of games that run that gambit. Is like Pathfinder or 3.5 especially is a great example of that, where it's like, if you choose the wrong options in 3.5 and somebody next to you is choosing the right ones, you look terrible. Your character is useless.
Yeah, and so much of that game is actually balanced around assuming that you know how to make your characters in a way that is powerful within the game.
Yeah.
If you have like a wide range between PCs, then it's just impossible to make any encounters that actually like feel good to do as a party. It's either hyper lethal for half the party and sort of like a moderate challenge for the one or two people, or it's a complete joke for the one or two people and an okay challenge for the rest.
Yeah, it's the Crusher problem.
Although in the case of Shadowrun, there is a sort of counterbalance that if you have to hyper specialize, but that also means you have a big weakness, like Crusher, for example. Crusher at the physical level can take a lot of damage and certainly deal a lot of damage. He's literally the tank. Anybody does even a wisp of magic around him, and he's in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, no, you're right. But so I think Adam actually mentioned this a couple times on when he was hacking the game with Steven. It was like, yeah, like I could just throw magic at him and just like kill him with magic really easily. But like it just starts getting old really fast when it's kryptonite. You know what I mean? It's like, Superman's doing really well. What's going to happen? It's kryptonite. Lex Luthor's coming back again. What does he have? What does he have this time? It was kryptonite. Right? So it's just like when you have that super like specialized and then have like a big weakness, the weakness either just starts to get kind of boring or you learn to cover it. Right? So like if they actually had a mage who knew what they were doing, Crusher would probably be in a bit better of a situation.
Yeah, I think a lot of that does come down to like where Mirror Shades went during play versus how Shadowrun is designed. Like it's designed around, you have this weakness, but you also gamed your entire party so that another party member completely covers up that weakness, which is not something that really happened.
Yeah.
But then it's sort of old school. It's interesting. Shadowrun has a lot of story, and I think it has some of the mechanics like Karma that sort of encourage players to sort of try to influence the world. But then at the core of each character is very mechanically driven because you have to have create your character in such a way that it's very good at that one thing or very small range of things. And it doesn't seem to be a balance. I mean, Adam did balance it in the way that the way he presented both the Karma and he allowed the player to sort of go and do their own thing. But if you're playing the game as set up by the mechanics, you wouldn't see that a lot.
Definitely.
Yeah. Something else I noticed is that games that are less character focused sort of conversely sort of almost require, or just by some byproduct of how they came about, they have a massive, massive base of pre-existing setting and lore and story. And I think a lot of that comes down to if your game is based around sort of like a heavy prep style, where you have to create like super intricate settings and it's based around your players going up against these settings or scenarios and figuring out how to beat them. So much of that is based around, do I have enough material to make this setting, this scenario robust and like complete and difficult? While with a lot of character-based things, you don't need a fleshed out world because you can make it during the game. If your players push against that, it's not going to break the scenario.
Yeah, that's a great point where it's like kind of what it comes down to is if your game is going to be about the world, your world sure as hell better be interesting and it better be there. Yeah, I think it's a very fine line to walk where, giving the GMs and the players the ability to sort of warp the setting and make it their own versus providing something so that it's not totally on the players and on the GM to create that world. But I think different games deal with it very differently. I think there is something to be said for having some sort of pre-existing setting, but it's not super my style, to be honest, as a GM. I prefer it as a player.
I think it's a path most GMs follow as they develop their skills and get better, where I know starting out, I was just very not confident in my abilities to improv things, to make rulings on the spot, to really just run the game. And so I always gravitated towards systems that had a lot more depth to them in terms of rules and story and setting and pre-made monsters and characters, a lot of material to draw from or look up, because it provided a good safety net. But as my abilities improved and I had a lot more experience, it reached a point where I felt it was more limiting than it was helpful.
Yeah, it got to the point where
running less and less.
Yeah, it gets to the point where the training wheels are no longer keeping you on the bike, but slowing you down.
Yeah, it's a phenomenon that I think it's called, there's always a rule. Because I always like to think of any information that is already published, I treat it as a rule. And I make the distinction between the hard rules, which usually are the mechanical rules, the adding and subtracting, the percentages, the dice rolls, and the soft rules that say everything else. If I have in my world book, a place called Candy La La Land, in the absence of me as a GM saying there is no such place or has a different name, that is the rule, and the rule says that exists. So if I go there, I have to follow the rule. And the rules can be helpful until you sort of become constrained by them. And if you deviate too much from them, then you're sort of unhinged from the setting, and it sort of loses its benefit.
Yeah, it's the more you hack the setting, the more you have to hack the setting to make up for the changes your hacks made. And at some point, it just becomes more hassle than it's worth to keep using that existing system.
It starts to become like a Jenga tower. First couple blocks you can pull out fine, but once you start pulling out, the 15th block, it starts to get real wobbly.
And some people are comfortable just going completely off the cuff all the time in their settings, but other times it totally depends on how your group works in some ways, and in other ways it's also what you're actually trying to get out of the game. So a lot of it comes down to how much do you even engage with the rules in the first place. Because with a lot of D&D games, it ends up being not very much at all ever.
That's true. It's a great point.
Which brings us to the role. You guys are both GM games, so it brings us to the question of what is the role of the GM? Because in an established setting, in a setting where usually you have a lot of published modules or adventures, the GM is the person who, quote unquote, runs the game. They read it, they study it, and they say, okay, I'm going to present the scenario to you and the challenges, etc. In the other type of game, it's very much a different role. What exactly is the role in a more free-flowing, character-driven type game for a GM?
That's a good question. I think it depends pretty heavily on the game. A word that a lot of GM-less games use that I like is facilitator, where it's sort of you're a player as well. You're part of that creative process, but you're just sort of the one who keeps things from getting out of control, makes sure that the game is still being played as opposed to just going completely off the rails. In a game that has a more established GM, I think the role is it's sort of like a first among equals. type of relationship in my mind, where it's everyone has creative control, but someone needs to be able to break ties and run the game. I mean, it's kind of a cop-out to say, but that's what it comes down to for me.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is sort of ironically, more modern and character-driven games end up putting the GM more and more into a role of being like the social focal point of the group, or like the social mediator, where a lot of your job comes down to mediating relationships and drawing like the focus of conversation and story, and sort of like moving things along in a more social manner, which was something that was sort of criticized with more traditional systems, because the role of the GM in more traditional systems came down to, like, to use like the metaphor of a video game, the GM is the video game. They are what makes all the pieces of the game move and work and just sort of react, while the rest of the players are literally just the people playing the video game. And so a lot of the time, traditionally, the GM is also going to be the person who's sort of like taking on that role of like social mediator. And so there was some pushback of that, where a lot of people were saying, well, the GM doesn't have to be the guy who organizes the group and makes sure everyone stays focused and on task and things. That can really be any player. Like, it doesn't really, anyone doing the game can really fill that role in a more mechanical system. But when you get to the much more character-driven scenarios, that's less and less true, because you don't really need a person to sort of mediate the system anymore. You need someone to sort of push things forward and keep things focused in a more social manner. So it's sort of like transitioned into being the thing it didn't want, while throwing away sort of the element that it originally was in the first place.
So a useful distinction would be the difference between someone setting a group of people around them and telling them a story versus being more of a party host, right? You set up the environment and then let the people sort of come together, and you sort of help certain people match up with other people, and you sort of set the general tone with music and the hors d'oeuvres and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, the people sort of have to come up with their own want and need to be there and enjoy the festivities, if that makes any sense.
I think that's
one
a good
is
point.
Very much a party host, and the other one is very much like running an actual like organized game.
You go ahead, Sam.
I think that's a good point, and I think it's interesting because sort of this idea, that like sort of old school way of thinking about it, is almost a lie a little bit, where it's like sort of, I think a very close step from the GM is in charge of the game is the GM is in charge of everyone having fun. And that's just not really something that you can ever do. Like, people need to like bring their own fun to the table. It's impossible to make people have fun, which I think is why it's like sort of interesting to have that dynamic. I also find it interesting how few games give you rules for that like role. Like, not a lot of games are very good at teaching you how to be that GM, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of that. Okay, go.
Sorry. I remember reading I have it here somewhere, the original Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master Guide. And it very much goes into sort of the world building, because it assumes, ironically, and this was Gary Gygax who brought us Greyhawk and then through their Dragonlance and all these world settings, assumes that the GM will construct the setting, right? These are the rules to play ironically, sort of a generic fantasy adventure. You're the one who gets to construct it. But running it, I mean, there's a lot of tips out there and even books about running, GM and all that. But I rarely seen, as Sam pointed out, a real book that says, you know what, these are some of the things that you have to sort of go through and you're going to experience. I never found that. Either there probably is a book out there and I haven't seen it, or the rules themselves are not designed to teach the GM to run the game. They're designed to teach players how to run the game, but not how to GM it.
Yeah, I think part of that comes from where the games originated in, and sort of like that original ethos where the GM was more referee of like a tabletop war game. So like, to use the Warhammer analogy, the GM isn't one of the people sort of like directly involved. The GM is the guy watching over as referee, making sure that everyone's moves are legal and within the system, and sort of like providing the setting that this battle is going on within. But as it's evolved over time, all of those skills aren't really necessary anymore. But all of the skills people need to learn to do are things like how to be a good conversationalist, or like how to develop a good ability to like invoke emotions in others, or like be very empathic or persuasive or descriptive in your speech. And a lot of these are skills that first nerds are almost never taught in any formal way. And when they do actually learn them over time, they've never been talked about in any formal manner. So no one really knows how to like convey these in a useful fashion. And so like so many of the skills I end up using as a GM didn't come from role-playing. They came from things like speech and debate, or learning psychology and like counseling and all of that. It came from very disparate sort of areas, but they're all directly relevant to how do you manage relationships between people and how do you invoke like emotions in people.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Which brings me to the question of, as GMs, what do we get out of GMing? You know, what is it, especially in a character-driven game, that would attract a GM? It's like, as GMs, what do we really get out of character-driven games exactly?
Well, personally, I'm there for the story. I'm there to figure out what happens. And in character-driven games, especially for me, I'm there because I want to see how I can push at those characters and how they'll react in the different ways when I do different things. How can I pit those beliefs against each other in Burning Wheel, and basically see how these characters grow and change with the story.
For me, it sort of ended up as an outgrowth of why I started GMing in the first place, which was basically, I want to do this, and I'm the only person with the drive and motivation to actually put a group together and learn the setting and teach everyone else how to do it. But a lot of that turned into, I really enjoyed the process then of understanding these systems in a complex way, and sort of like managing all these relationships between people, or like poking people's buttons and getting them to have like emotional reactions to things. And eventually it was like, I can play characters now in a fun way where I have like a lot of emotion and stuff, but it gives me a lot more tools as a GM to sort of like poke at my players and sort of like get them to react to things in an interesting way or create interesting stories. Is because it's such a skill that I've like just developed over time. It's a lot easier to create interesting stories from the point of being a GM than it is as a player anymore.
Well, in my experience, the part I really like is the part where I sort of roleplay an NPC. And I have that situation where I'm having fun roleplaying the NPC, and I see the reactions of the players. At least for me, those are the most memorable parts. And because I'm a GM, I can roleplay a host of characters. And when I have those memorable moments with the players, how they act and react and how they shape each other, I think that's the part I really get a lot of enjoyment, more than just rolling die or combat or anything else.
Yeah, that's a great point, is you also get to play types of characters that you would like never play or get to play really as a player. I come up with ideas for characters all the time that just, the concept just doesn't quite work as a character. They know too much, or they're, mechanically goofy, or, whatever, what have you. But I can just use them as NPCs.
Yeah, every time you come up with
break mechanics.
Every time you come up with some weird, neat, quirky character trait, or like half fleshed out idea for like who a character would be as a player, where it doesn't quite work if you go all the way to PC. Well, now you have an outlet for all of those things, where it's like, oh, this combination would be sort of quirky and cool. Well, because they're only going to be on screen for like maybe 30 minutes at most. Let's do it. You can play out what all that character would be, what all that interaction would be within their whole time on screen.
So, yeah, to wrap it up, basically we have largely come down on the side of the games that we like are newer types of games that are character-driven and give everyone, GM and player, like an input into molding and shaping the setting. So any final thoughts?
Thanks for facilitating all of this, Raphael. It's been a pleasure to talk to you guys.
Yeah, it's been fun. Look forward to doing this in the future.
Hopefully we'll have the same time, recorded at the same time. It won't, to people who are listening to this, won't come out immediately because it takes a little bit of work to put it out there. But it will be up usually on Monday or Tuesday of this week. As always, if you like this or any video or podcast on my channel, please comment and subscribe. And we will see you when we see you back with the Math Squad. Good night.